As of this morning, no sitting member of Congress is expected to attend tomorrow's rally on Capitol Hill, but that hardly means that many of them don't support the cause. Despite more than 600 people currently facing federal charges related to January 6th, here's Texas Republican Congressman Louis Gohmert.
The overwhelming number of people caught up in this, quote, unprecedented investigation, they're actually nonviolent, peaceful Americans. Their only crime was supporting Donald Trump.
North Carolina Congressman Madison Cawthorn pushing the rioters' defense narrative even further, labeling them political hostages.
We have 536 people who are being held in solitary confinement, who are having their rights stripped away from them, not being able, incapable of being able to have someone come represent them. It's political hostages.
Echoing him, Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who for months has taken up the cause of making baseless allegations regarding the treatment of Capitol riot detainees, saying in an email statement this week to the New York Times, quote, there's a two-track justice system in America, and the treatment of the J6 as she calls them, political prisoners compared with violent Antifa BLM rioters proves it. Just how pervasive is this sentiment among Republicans on Capitol Hill? Well, Politico this week quoted one sitting GOP lawmaker who spoke on the condition of anonymity. Quote, the majority of the Republican base feels that January 6th was justified. And because those people didn't have arms, they shouldn't be incarcerated right now. So what most of the aforementioned lawmakers have in common, voting to overturn the results of the 2020 election in support of one man, of course, Donald J. Trump. The former president rounding out the GOP's show of solidarity with January 6 rioters this week, not missing an opportunity to promote the big lie, saying this in a statement, quote, our hearts and minds are with the people being persecuted so unfairly related to the January 6 protests concerning the rigged presidential election.
So with more on this, let's bring in CNN anchor and chief national affairs analyst Casey Hunt. Casey, I want to tie this all together, right? This rally that Capitol Hill is bracing for tomorrow, the threat of violence, and the fact that Congressman Anthony Gonzalez of Ohio, one of 10 Republicans to vote for impeachment, announced he will not run for re-election. Donald Trump with a statement overnight in support of the insurrectionists. So in many ways, the leader of the Republican Party and Republican leadership, Kevin McCarthy, raising the insurrectionists up and pushing the people who stood against them, like Anthony Gonzalez, down. This is, I think, an important thing to acknowledge.
For sure, John. And I think let's underscore, the former president used the word persecuted in the statement. That is not what is going on here. They are being prosecuted because they have been charged with federal crimes, and there's video evidence to prove it. If we are sticking with the facts of what happened on that day, there were people who used, perhaps they didn't bring their own arms to the Capitol, but they used what they found there to beat Capitol police officers, so many of whom were injured, several of whom died as a result of what happened on that day. Let's not forget that. And it's just continues to be remarkable to me that the former president centers the people who did that to police officers instead of those law enforcement officials who were protecting both Democrats and Republicans whose lives were at risk inside that building on that day. But this is the big picture of what's going on inside the Republican Party and has been over the course of the last 4 years. What you have seen is that, and frankly, as I have spoken to many Republicans, the theme was always how behind the scenes everyone was horrified by what the former president was doing when he was in office, but none of them were willing to say it in public because they were going to face these kinds of threats and problems that Anthony Gonzalez, the congressman who's now stepping down, is pointing to as he says, look, I just simply can't do this anymore. And so instead what happened was, instead of this sort of groundswell from all of the elected Republicans who had concerns but weren't willing to say it, you had one person at a time step out, basically stick their neck out, say, I can't put up with this anymore. And one by one, have them either decide to retire because they didn't want to run a race that was going to be counter to their own values. Look at Jeff Flake. You could argue Bob Corker also made a similar decision there. Liz Cheney is actually really the only one right now who's saying, you know what, forget it, bring it on. I'm going to fight this fight. There are some critics of Republicans who, were willing to vote for impeachment or willing to say something and then say, you know what, I'm not going to say anything else because I'm concerned about my family. They say, hey, this is why you got into it. You got to be willing to take this criticism. But I think we really have to look inside ourselves as Americans and say, what kind of country is it where if you speak out politically and oppose someone, that your family has to then be met by law enforcement officers to physically protect them from harm? I mean, that's the opposite of what the First Amendment and the way our Constitution was supposed to work.
Clearly the former president is stirring the pot here. So let's talk about what the conditions in the pot are. You have DHS warning of violence today and tomorrow, not just tomorrow, also today. Capitol Hill police officers, several of them, have actually sued insurrectionists. Capitol Police are worried that protesters are going to show up armed. And the fences have gone up. I mean, they have briefed leadership in Congress. There are huge concerns here, and yet the president is still saying what he's saying, knowing what happened on January 6th. It doesn't seem like he cares if he incites violence.
It doesn't. And remember, on January 6th itself, there were so many people trying to get him to call them off at the time. And he, didn't do anything for hours. Eventually, there was a tweet, there was a video, but it wasn't enough in the view of a lot of people on that very day. And let's not forget, he was the one who sent those people there. And that's why this statement that he put out, I think, is significant, because he is essentially sending another signal. And the other piece of this that I think is important, Brianna, is that I would draw a distinction between two groups that were there at the insurrection, because there were quite a few people who followed what Donald Trump said, who had come to the mall to rally to support the former president when he was making that speech. And a lot of them got swept up in something that was clearly more aggressively planned among some of these groups, like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, right? The ones who showed up with guns in their cars, with zip ties, dressed in tactical gear. And the forces combined together, and I'm not trying to let the Trump supporters who entered the Capitol off the hook. I'm just saying that those dangerous elements are the ones that really listen to every single signal that the former president sends, right? They are the ones that hear the message, that he is telling them to stand ready, for example, was something that happened earlier, stand by. It's those groups that hear that. And it's those groups, we still don't know, for example, who set the pipe bombs at the RNC and the DNC on January 6th. And if it's those groups that are the most motivated, the ones that listen most closely to Donald Trump, and the ones who are most inclined to violence, I think that shows you why today and tomorrow could be potentially difficult. You don't have that big rally crowd that the president was ginning up that did include a wider variety of Trump supporters than just his most extreme ones. But at the same time, I think it's those people, again, who are potentially likely to be activated. Now, the only other thing I would say, too, is that it is also possible that this turns out, and knock on wood, it's how it goes, not very much. And this is law enforcement saying, OK, we're not going to make the same mistakes again. They know that they absolutely can't do that. But of course, the risk is there. So here we are.